My grandfather kept a single rule about the back porch of his property in Trinity County. After dark, the door stays shut. No exceptions. Didn't matter if you heard something out there. Didn't matter if it was the dogs barking or the chickens raising hell or whatever else. The back porch door stays shut until sunup, and if you open it before then, you don't live under his roof anymore. He never explained the rule. Not to my grandmother, not to my dad, not to any of the 4 kids who grew up in that house on the South Fork of the Trinity River. He'd had the rule since before any of them were born. The door had a bolt on it, heavy iron, the kind you'd put on a cellar in a floodplain. He'd installed it himself the year he built the house, 1962. Everyone just accepted it the way you accept certain things about the adults in your life. That's just how Grandpa is. That's just what Grandpa does. You don't push on it. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've ever had an encounter like this. I found out why in the summer of 2019. He was 81 years old, living alone after my grandmother passed, and his memory was going in patches. The doctor called it vascular dementia, which meant some days were clear and some days weren't. And on the clear days, the things he'd kept locked up for decades started coming loose. I want to be precise about what that looked like. Because dementia can sound like a man who's confused, who's confabulating, who's mixing up dreams with memory and experience with something he saw on television 40 years ago. That's not what was happening on the clear days. On the clear days, he was as sharp as he'd been at 60. Better, maybe, because whatever gate was held shut by the effort of keeping things private had started to give way, and the things coming through weren't confused. They were specific. They were measured. They had the exact texture of recollection rather than invention, the way real memory has the wrong details in it, the irrelevant ones, the ones you wouldn't include if you were making something up. I was visiting for a week, helping him with things around the property that he couldn't manage alone anymore. Firewood, roof gutters, the fence line along the creek that had been sagging since a winter storm took out 2 of the cedar posts. It was a warm July, dry already, the hills above the South Fork brown and gold the way they get by midsummer in that county. We'd been working since 7 in the morning, and by 3 in the afternoon, the heat was serious enough that we'd knocked off and come back to the house. On the 3rd afternoon, we were sitting on the front porch, and never the back, drinking iced tea, and he looked out at the tree line across the road and said, out of nowhere, "I never told you about the summer of '77. I said, "No, you didn't." He nodded slowly, like he'd been deciding something for a long time, and had just now made up his mind. He looked at his hands, then at the trees. He said, "I want to tell it right. Give me a minute to get back to where it started." So I gave him a minute. The ice in my glass had melted by the time he started talking. Arlen Pruitt was 59 years old in the summer of 1977, which puts his birth year at 1918, Trinity County born, the son of a timber faller who worked the old-growth Douglas fir before most of it was gone. His father, Arlen Pruitt, had fallen timber for Fruit Growers Supply Company out of the Upper Trinity watershed through the late 30s and into the war years, when the big stands of old-growth Douglas fir were still being worked. Arlen had gone out with him as a boy, starting around 10, 11 years old, not to work but to be there, to carry the lunch pail and hand up the tools and watch the sequence of it. By the time he was 14, he was doing light rigging work on weekends, and by 16, he had his own tools, and his father was treating him as a working member of the crew. He learned the woods as a workplace before he learned it as anything else, which meant he came to everything in the natural world with the eye of a man who was assessing its practical properties rather than its aesthetic ones. A tree was a resource and a hazard and a living system and an indicator of soil conditions all at once. A track in mud was information about the animal that made it, its weight and speed and direction, and how recently it had passed. A sound in the timber at night was either something he could identify or something he needed to identify. He didn't have a category for wonder, exactly. He had a category for things he knew and things he was still working out. Felling old growth is nothing like felling the second growth you see today. The trees Darnell worked were 6, 7, 8 feet across at the base, 150, 200 feet tall. Arlen told me once that when a tree that size comes down, the sound of it hitting the ground travels through the soil before the sound of the fall travels through the air. You feel it in your feet before you hear it. And in the moment after, the birds go quiet for about 30 seconds, like the whole forest is trying to decide what just happened. He said he thought about that sound a lot. After September of 1977, the way a big enough thing can announce itself through the ground before you ever hear it coming. Arlen Pruitt died in 1951, a falling accident on a steep unit about 6 miles up the South Fork. The kind of accident that happened when a faller misjudged a lean, and the tree kicked back off the stump. Arlen was 33. He'd been working alongside his father for 20 years by that point, had his own falling experience, had worked as a choker setter before that, and a timber cruiser before that. He knew the woods as a workplace, the way most people know the inside of an office. Not with love, exactly, but with the deep familiarity that comes from depending on something for your livelihood over years and years. After his father died, he took a few years off the timber work and did what a lot of men in that county did when they needed steadier income. He went into general labor, fencing, road maintenance, that kind of thing. He married Loretta in 1953. He started building the house on the South Fork property in 1961, finished it in 1962. He'd grown up in and around those woods the way a lot of men his age in that county had, which means he knew them the way you only know a place when you've spent your whole life in it. He wasn't a man who scared easily, and he wasn't a man who talked about things he couldn't explain. That's not stubbornness, exactly. It's more of a regional trait. You keep the strange things to yourself because if you don't, people start looking at you sideways, and you have to live next to those people for the rest of your life. The property was 42 acres on a ridge above the South Fork Trinity River, about 12 miles southeast of Hayfork. If you know Trinity County at all, you know how remote that is. It's one of those pockets of California that the rest of the state barely acknowledges, hemmed in by ridgelines on every side, road access a single 2-lane highway that closes when the slides come down in winter. The Forest Service manages a significant portion of the land in that area, most of it under the Shasta Trinity National Forest umbrella. And in 1977, there were stretches of that country that saw maybe 2 or 3 people a year. Trailless, roadless, big second-growth fir and tan oak and madrone covering drainages that ran steep to the Trinity River and its forks. The nearest neighbor was a man named Gus Fenwick, a retired Forest Service fire lookout who lived about 1.5 miles down the road. The nearest store was in Hayfork, 20 minutes if the road was dry, longer if it wasn't. There was no cell service, obviously. There was a telephone landline that had been reliable for about 40% of its existence. There was a 2-way radio that my grandfather had bought second-hand from a logging outfit in Weaverville. which he mostly used to check weather and talk to a guy named Roy Sandoval, who ran cattle about 8 miles east. Trinity County in 1977 was, in the important ways, about as far from anywhere as you could get in California without crossing into Nevada, which matters for reasons that will become clear. The house sat on a cleared flat about 200 yards back from the county road. There was a barn, a small outbuilding where he kept the tractor and the chainsaw, and a lot of things that needed to be kept dry, and a chicken coop that he'd built with his son Dale, my dad's oldest brother, who was 19 that summer. The back of the property dropped off into a ravine, and then climbed back up into a ridgeline covered in Douglas fir and tannoac, second growth mostly, the original timber having been logged off sometime in the 30s or 40s. The ravine had a seasonal creek in it that ran from about November through June most years, and went dry by late summer. There was a trail down into the ravine that my grandfather had cut himself, used it mostly for deer hunting, sometimes for checking on a spring that fed into a small stock pond near the south fence line. I want to give you a clearer picture of what that country looks like, because I think it matters for the rest of the story. When I was a kid, the ravine felt like the edge of the world. You'd cross the yard, and the grass would thin out, and the ground would start to slope, and then you'd be on the trail, a single-file path that switchbacked down through a tangle of ceanothus and Oregon grape and young fir that grew thick in the ravine's moisture. The canopy closed overhead within about 30 feet of the yard's edge. You lost the sky. What you had instead was filtered light and the smell of the ravine, which in summer was dry soil and bay laurel, and the particular dusty sweetness of ceanothus, and in spring was running water and new fern growth, and something green and wet underneath everything else. The sound of the property disappeared. Even the chickens, which you could hear from anywhere on the cleared land above, went silent inside the ravine's walls. My grandfather had hunted that ravine for 30 years and had learned its specific grammar, which bends the deer used, where the blackberries grew dense enough in August to draw the bears, where the creek pooled deepest in spring, and which pool held the small bass that I, as a kid, spent entire afternoons failing to catch. He knew the ravine as well as he knew any room in the house, which is to say that any deviation from what was normal was immediately apparent to him. The Forest Service land began at the south fence line, about 200 yards south of the ravine's center, and ran from there for miles in every direction. No roads into it from his side, no trails except the occasional game trail that the deer maintained. Just the second-growth timber, and the drainages and the ridgelines and whatever lived in them. That summer was a dry one. The South Fork was lower than usual by July, and the forest was tinder by August. There had been a fire up near the Yola Bali-Middle Wilderness the previous year that had burned through a lot of terrain to the north, and people in the county were nervous about the conditions. My grandfather was watering his kitchen garden by hand, something he usually didn't have to do until September, and the deer were coming down lower than normal into the margins of the cleared land around the house, because the browse in the upper elevations was eaten out. He'd been seeing the deer more than usual. Whitetails mostly, some blacktails, a doe with twin fawns that had been coming to the edge of the yard near the woodpile every evening around dusk for about 3 weeks. He didn't mind the deer. He had a kitchen garden, but he'd fenced it well and they weren't getting in. He noted them the way a man who's lived in a place for 15 years notes things that are part of the ordinary rhythm of it. What he started noting in the 3rd week of August was that something was pressuring the deer. They were coming into the yard earlier. Not at dusk, the way they had been, but in the afternoon, sometimes as early as 3 or 3:30, while it was still full light. The doe with the twins stopped coming entirely. The deer that did show up were moving differently than they had been. Less browsing, more standing at the edge of the tree line, with their heads up and their ears working. A buck with a good rack showed up one afternoon and stood at the corner of the barn for 20 minutes, which is not normal behavior for a deer that size in summer. Bucks like that are ghosts until the rut. They don't stand around in open ground next to a building in the middle of the afternoon. My grandfather watched this from the kitchen window for a few days and tried to work out what was pushing the deer down. The fire danger was high, but there was no smoke visible from the ridge. The creek in the ravine was dry by then, but that had been true for 6 weeks, and the deer behavior had only changed recently. He asked Roy Sandoval on the two-way if he'd had anything come through his cattle that he couldn't account for. Cougar or bear working the area. Roy said no, nothing recent, but that his dog had been acting up for a couple of days, barking at the west fence line in the evenings for no reason he could see. He filed that away. Roy Sandoval's dog was a cattle-dog mix named Birdie, who'd worked cattle for 7 years and had the calm disposition of an animal that had been around large livestock its whole life. Cattle dogs don't spook easily. Whatever was at Roy's west fence line in the evenings had gotten Birdie's attention in a way that his cattle, with all their associated smells and sounds, had not managed to do in 7 years. That mattered. He tried Roy again 3 days later. He said he'd been thinking about the dog business and asked if Birdie was still acting up. Roy was quiet for a moment, the particular radio silence of a man deciding how much to say. Then he said that Birdie had stopped sleeping in the barn. She was sleeping on the front porch now, and she wouldn't go around the back of the house after dark. He said it like he was reporting weather with the same tone. But Roy was not a man who talked about his animal's behavior, unless it meant something to him. He figured it was a cougar. Trinity County has always had a good population of mountain lions, and a cougar working a territory can put pressure on the whole prey community for miles around. The deer feel it before you see any sign. He started checking around the property more carefully, looking for tracks in the soft soil along the south fence where the stock pond made things muddy. He found deer tracks, raccoon tracks, what he was pretty sure was a black bear, and one set of dog tracks that were bigger than he'd like from an animal that was probably running loose from someone's property. He did not find cougar tracks. What he found instead, on the morning of August the 23rd, was a set of tracks in the mud at the edge of the stock pond that he couldn't account for. He described them to me in the specific way that a man who has spent decades in the woods describes tracks, not by saying what they looked like, but by saying what they weren't. They weren't bear. He knew bear tracks cold. These were not plantigrade the way a bear's hind foot is, not quite. They were bipedal, meaning there was only one set, not a front and back paired the way a walking bear leaves. They were roughly human in shape, but larger, considerably larger, and the stride length between them was too long for a human. He paced it out, 4.5 feet between prints at what looked like a walking gait. He's a 6-foot man with a long stride, and his walking pace covered about 2.5 feet. He put it through again. He walked the stride length once more in both directions, being careful about his own gait, making sure he was walking at his normal pace, and not unconsciously shortening or lengthening to fit an expectation, 4.5 feet, consistent, He got down on one knee and looked at the leading edge of one of the prints, the way you look at a track to assess freshness. The edge was clean, minimal crumbling. Whatever had made it had come through within the last few hours, he estimated, probably in the early morning before the heat started to dry the mud. He measured one of the prints with his folding rule, the kind he carried in his shirt pocket out of habit from his years as a timber faller before his back gave out, and he'd shifted to more general logging work, 14 inches long, 5.5 wide at the ball, 5 distinct toe impressions, broader and less tapered than a human foot, and a heel impression that sank noticeably deeper than the ball of the foot, which is the opposite of what you see in a human track. He stood there at the edge of the stock pond for a while, looking at those tracks and trying to give them a reasonable explanation. He was a practical man. He didn't reach for the unreasonable when the reasonable was still available. He considered the tracks carefully and decided he must have misjudged the stride length, that they were probably human, some hunter or hiker who'd come across the property line from Forest Service land to the south. He made a mental note to post some additional no trespassing signs along the south fence and went back to what he'd been doing. He went back to splitting firewood. He stacked what he'd split. He ate lunch on the front porch. He watched the tree line on the south side while he ate, which was something he'd been doing more consciously over the last week. The tree line was quiet. A scrub jay made its usual racket in the oaks near the barn. A pair of ravens crossed high overhead, riding something thermal, not paying attention to anything below them. The afternoon passed the way afternoons do in August in the mountains, slowly and with heat. He didn't go back to the stock pond that day. He went back the following morning early before the heat. The tracks were still there, drying now, the edges beginning to crumble slightly as the August sun worked on the mud. He looked at them for a long time, with the morning light slanting through the fir canopy, and the scrub jays making noise in the manzanita on the slope above the pond. He looked at them and he made a decision, which was to not make a decision yet. He would watch for more sign. He would keep his eyes open. He would not alarm Loretta until he had more to go on. He told me this, the rationalizing, the mental note about the signs, and then he laughed. Not a happy laugh, more the kind of laugh a man uses when he's looking back at himself doing something that, in retrospect, was obviously insufficient. "I knew," he said, right then, standing there. "I knew it wasn't a person's track. I just wasn't ready to know it yet." Quick thing before we get into this part. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called The Bigfoot Codex. If you ever want more, it's linked below. Either way, let's get into the story.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called The Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, link's down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
For the next 4 days, nothing happened that he couldn't rationalize. The deer were still coming in during the afternoon. His dog, a bluetick hound named Patch, who had been with him since she was 8 weeks old and was now 7 years old, and as steady as a dog can be, started sleeping under the porch during the day instead of in her usual spot in the barn. He chalked this up to the heat. The nights were warm that August, the kind of warm that doesn't break much even after midnight. Patch sleeping under the porch where the ground stayed cooler made sense. On the evening of August 27th, he was sitting on the front porch after dinner, the way he did most evenings, when Patch came out from under the porch and stood in the yard with her nose up. She didn't bark. That was the first thing that registered as wrong. Patch was not a silent dog. She'd bark at anything that came onto the property: deer, raccoons, the UPS truck, Roy Sandoval's truck, which he'd been seeing for years and still treated with suspicion every single time. She barked. It was what she did. She stood in the yard with her nose up, and she did not bark, and she did not move, and the hair along her spine was raised from her shoulders to her tail. He watched her for a minute. Then he got up and went inside and got the .30-06 from the cabinet in the bedroom. He checked that it was loaded, which it always was, and he came back out onto the porch. He didn't see anything. Patch stayed frozen for another couple of minutes. Then the hair on her back slowly flattened, and she turned and went back under the porch. She didn't come out again that evening. He sat on the front porch until full dark with the rifle across his knees. The woods were quiet, he said, quieter than they should have been. It was August, which in Trinity County means the nights are full of sound, crickets, tree frogs, the occasional owl. That night, for about 40 minutes, starting right around the time Patch went on point, there was almost nothing, just the wind in the firs and once, faintly, from the direction of the ravine to the back of the property, a sound he described to me as knocking. 2 knocks, he said, like somebody hitting a fence post with a bat. But there was no fence post out there, just timber. He paused. Then about 2 minutes later, 2 more, same sound, from a different direction, further east, up the ridge. He told my grandmother Loretta about it that night. She was not a woman who scared easily either. She'd grown up in Del Norte County, further north and arguably even more remote than Trinity, the daughter of a commercial fisherman and a woman who ran a small dairy. She'd seen bears in her backyard as a kid, had a general attitude toward wildlife that was matter-of-fact, and was not given to the kind of anxiety that feeds on itself in isolated places. The thing about Loretta that I want you to understand, because it matters for everything that comes after, is that she was not a woman who needed things explained to her. She observed, she filed things away, and she drew conclusions on her own timeline. She'd grown up in a household where the rhythms of the natural world were practical realities, not sources of wonder or fear. Her father had fished out of the Crescent City harbor for 30 years. He knew the weather by the way the swells came in, could read a change in the fishing grounds 2 days out. Her mother had run 30 dairy cows, which means she'd spent her whole adult life paying close attention to the behavior of large animals that could hurt you if you misread them. Loretta had inherited both of those habits, the close watching and the calm interpretation. She'd been watching the deer too, my grandfather said. She hadn't said anything to him about it, but when he brought it up that August, she'd told him she'd noticed it 10 days before he had. The doe with the twins had stopped coming in. The bucks were standing in open ground in the afternoon. She'd registered all of it and had been waiting to see what else accumulated before she said anything. That was Loretta. She didn't bring a thing to the table before she was ready to make a full case for it. She listened to what he told her about Patch and the quiet and the knocking sounds, and she said, "You think there's something down in that ravine?" He said he thought there might be. She said, "Well, keep the back door bolted tonight." He said he already planned to. That was August 27th. For the next 8 days, he would hear the knocking sounds 3 more times, always at night, always from the direction of the ravine or the ridgeline above it, always in pairs, with a response from a different location about a minute or 2 after the first. He found tracks twice more during that period, once in the mud at the south fence line, and once in a stretch of soft soil along the dry creek bed in the ravine that he'd walked down to check on the 29th. The tracks in the ravine were fresh, made in the previous 24 hours. he estimated, based on how clean the edges still were, no crumbling or desiccation. There were 3 separate sets of them along about 60 feet of creek bed. 2 sets were roughly the same size, the 14-inch tracks he'd found at the stock pond. The 3rd set was different. He almost missed it. The 3rd set was off to one side of the main line, in a patch of fine silt that had settled at the base of a boulder, and the tracks were smaller. Not human-child small, but noticeably smaller than the other 2, maybe 9 inches in length, with the same basic shape. 5 toes, relatively wide forefoot, deep heel. And the stride length was different, too, about 2.5 feet. And the tracks were not in a straight line. They wandered, and in one place they went in a circle, the way a young animal will sometimes do, when it's not following a direct path but investigating things. He stood in that ravine for a long time with the September morning coming through the fir canopy and the dry creek bed crunching under his boots, and he looked at those 3 sets of tracks and understood what they were telling him. 2 adults and something younger, moving through the ravine below his house, probably using the dry creek bed as a travel corridor, the way wildlife does. Open ground, no brush to push through, easy going. He walked the creek bed slowly in both directions from where the tracks were, looking for more sign. About 40 feet upstream, he found where the larger set of tracks had approached from the south, from the direction of the Forest Service land beyond the south fence line, crossing the dry creek bed from one bank to the other. The stride there was longer, about 5 feet between prints, which suggested a faster pace than the walking gait he'd measured at the stock pond. Moving with purpose, he thought. Going somewhere. On the bank above the creek, where a tangle of bay laurel grew in a low canopy, there was a broken branch at a height of about 9 feet. Clean break, recent, white at the fracture. The kind of break that happens when something puts weight on a branch, not the kind that happens when wind or rot brings it down. The bay laurel had other branches at that height that were intact, which told him whatever had broken this one had done it in passing, not as any kind of deliberate action, just moving through the brushy canopy on the bank and clipping a branch with its shoulder or its arm. He stood in that ravine and looked at the creek bed and the tracks and the broken branch, and understood that whatever was moving through this drainage was moving through it as part of its regular travel. This was not a single unusual event. This was a route. The ravine below his house was part of a route that was used regularly and had probably been used long before he'd ever built anything above it. He went back up to the house and told Loretta. She asked if they needed to leave. He thought about it. He said no, they didn't need to leave. He said whatever was down there knew the house was here, had been here for weeks, and hadn't come up to the house. They were using the ravine. They weren't interested in the house. He told me he believed that mostly when he said it. Before I get to the night of September 4th, I need to tell you about a conversation my grandfather had with Gus Fenwick about 2 weeks into all of this, because it's one of those details that I find myself coming back to more than almost anything else he told me that afternoon. Gus Fenwick was 67 that summer, retired from the Forest Service after 32 years working various units in the Shasta Trinity National Forest. He'd spent most of his career as a fire lookout, which is about as solitary a job as exists in the federal government. 8-10 weeks at a time, in a tower on a high point, with a 360-degree view and a radio and not much else. Men who do that job for decades develop a particular quality of attention. They learn to notice what doesn't move and what shouldn't be moving. They learn the rhythms of a landscape the way musicians learn the structure of a piece, and they notice deviations from that structure the way a musician notices a wrong note. Gus had retired to a piece of land about 1.5 miles down the road from my grandfather's property in 1969. He kept to himself, mostly, was friendly when you saw him, but didn't seek company out. He had a garden, some chickens, a dog named Frank that looked like what happened when a German shepherd had an argument with a coyote. He and my grandfather had a standing arrangement to check in with each other if either of them went more than a few days without being seen on the road, the kind of informal welfare agreement that exists in remote rural communities and that everyone maintains without ever formally establishing. In the second week of August 1977, Gus came up the road to my grandfather's property one afternoon when Arlen was out splitting wood. He didn't say anything about why he'd come, just helped himself to the other splitting axe the way neighbors do and started working alongside him. They worked in silence for a while, the way men of that generation and that region often did. And then Gus said, without looking up from the round he was splitting, "You been hearing things at night?" My grandfather kept splitting. He said yes, sometimes. Gus nodded like he'd expected that answer. He split another round. "What kind of things?" My grandfather described the knocking sounds, the pairs, the response from the ridge. Gus was quiet for a moment. He set down the axe. He looked out toward the tree line on the south side of the property for what my grandfather said was a considerable amount of time. Then he said, "That's old country back there." He picked the axe back up. "Older than the Forest Service, older than the county. Some of what's in it has been in it a long time." He didn't say anything else about it. My grandfather asked him directly, had he heard those sounds before? Gus looked at him. He said, "When I was at the Backbone Rock Lookout in '61, I heard them every night for 6 weeks, September and October. Never saw anything. Never went looking." He paused. "Retirement suits me fine." That was the whole conversation. Gus didn't come back up until after September 4th, when my grandfather would have had much more to tell him and chose not to. And Gus never brought it up again either, which my grandfather thought was its own kind of answer. On the night of September 4th, 1977, Arlen Pruitt woke up at 2:15 in the morning to the sound of his dog screaming, not barking. Screaming is the word he used, and he was careful about it. Said he'd spent his whole life around hunting dogs and livestock dogs and working dogs of every kind, and he'd never heard a dog make that sound before or since. It was the sound of an animal in extreme distress, not pain exactly, but a level of terror that removed the animal's control over itself. He was out of bed and moving toward the front door with the rifle before he was fully awake. Loretta said his name, and he told her to stay in the bedroom, and she said very calmly she was coming with him. She picked up the .22 from behind the closet door. She'd put it there 2 weeks ago when he'd told her about the tracks, without him asking and without saying anything about it. He noticed this later, after. Her quiet practicality. Patch was under the front porch. The screaming had dropped to a high, continuous whimpering by the time he got outside. A sound that still wasn't right, wasn't normal dog noise, was still the sound of an animal that had exceeded its capacity for the fear it was being asked to contain. He called her name, and she didn't come out. He had to crouch down and physically reach under the porch boards and get his hand on her, and she still wouldn't move. He could feel her shaking against his palm. He stood up. Loretta was beside him on the front porch. The night was clear, 3/4 moon, enough light to see the yard and the tree line. Nothing moved, No sound except Patch's low, steady whimpering from under the porch. He stood there with the rifle, scanning the tree line. The property was quiet except for Patch's whimpering. The three-quarter moon was high enough to wash the yard in a pale, flat light that reduced everything to shades of gray. He could see the barn, the outbuilding, the woodpile, the fence line along the south pasture. He could see the edge of the yard where the grass ran out and the brush began before the drop into the ravine. Nothing moved, but there was something wrong about the shadows near the tree line on the south side. He couldn't have said specifically what it was. He'd grown up in these woods and he knew every texture of shadow that they produced, and one of the shadows was wrong. Too tall, too still, with the particular stillness that is different from the stillness of a tree or a fence post, because it is a chosen thing rather than a fixed one. He kept his eyes on it for a while. It didn't move. Then the wind shifted, and whatever he'd been seeing in the shadow resolved back into shadow, and there was nothing there. Then the smell hit him. He tried to describe it to me several times over the course of that afternoon, and each time he tried, he'd trail off and shake his head like the description wasn't right. He'd get part way there, and then realize he was still short of it. The closest he got was this. Imagine you took a wet dog and you put it inside a garbage can that had been sitting in the sun all week, and then you lit the garbage can on fire. He shook his head again. That's not it either. There was something underneath that, something old, like the inside of a cave. He paused. It got in your mouth. I could taste it for 2 days. The smell was coming from the back of the property. He went around the side of the house to where he could see the back porch. The back porch was a simple wood structure, 6 feet deep, running the full width of the rear of the house. There was a picnic table on it, some firewood stacked against the wall, the usual accumulation of things. A single bulb on the exterior wall above the back door, on a switch inside the kitchen. He hadn't turned it on. He stood at the corner of the house for a moment, not because he was afraid to go further, he told me, but because he needed to look before he moved. He needed to know what was on that porch before he walked around to it. There was something on the porch. He could see it from the corner of the house in the moonlight. A shape, low to the ground, against the wall near the firewood stack, not moving. He watched it for 30 seconds, and it didn't move. He went around the corner of the house and onto the back porch. He stopped at the threshold where the side yard met the back porch. The smell was stronger here. Not unbearable, but present in the air the way smoke from a distant fire is present. Something you become aware of and can't unbecome aware of. He could hear the breathing now. A slow, wet sound, a little irregular on the exhale. He crouched down to get a better look at the shape against the wall. It was a juvenile. That's the word he settled on after the fact, after 30 years of thinking about it. Juvenile. Whatever it was young. It was lying on its side against the wall of the house, and it was breathing. He could see the rise and fall of it in the moonlight, and it was approximately the size and general shape of a large dog, except that it wasn't a dog. The limbs were wrong, the proportions were wrong, the head was wrong, longer in the muzzle than a primate should be, broader at the crown, and the hands, he said, hands specifically, said he noticed the hands first, were tucked under the body, but one of them was visible, and it had 4 fingers and a thumb, long-fingered, curled slightly, dark-nailed, and it was wrong enough to be unmistakable and recognizable enough to hit him somewhere deep and pre-rational. The juvenile was covered in fine dark hair, grayish-brown in the moonlight, thicker along the shoulders and back than on the face, and hands. He couldn't tell precisely how large it was because it was curled, but he estimated later when he tried to work it through that it would have stood maybe 3 feet if it had been upright, maybe a little more. It wasn't upright. It was lying on its side on his back porch, and its breathing was labored, and along its left side, from just behind the shoulder back through the ribs. There was a dark wetness in the fur that in the moonlight he took for a moment to be shadow, and then understood was blood. It had been injured. My grandfather stood on the back porch of his house in the middle of the night with a rifle in his hands and a bleeding, unconscious juvenile Bigfoot at his feet, and he did what he said was the only thing he could think to do. He went inside and got a flashlight. He came back out and crouched down and looked at the wound with the flashlight, keeping the beam angled so it didn't shine toward the tree line. He said he wasn't thinking about what was out there in the tree line at that point, which in retrospect he acknowledged was probably not the most rational state to be in. But he was looking at this injured thing, and the injured thing was occupying his attention fully. The wound was a gash, roughly 6 inches long, running diagonally across the left rib area. It wasn't deep enough to have penetrated the chest cavity as far as he could tell. The breathing, though labored, was not the sucking chest sound he'd been taught to recognize from a first aid course he'd taken through the county extension service. It was a surface wound, but surface wounds on an animal this size, a juvenile, could bleed out. It had bled significantly. The fur around it was matted and stiff. He didn't know what had made the wound. A claw, maybe. Something with a straight edge, maybe. He couldn't tell from what he was looking at in the dark. In a hurry, with one hand on the towel and the other holding the flashlight steady. The gash was clean enough that his first instinct was a single powerful swipe, rather than a puncture or a bite, which pointed toward a predator attack rather than a fall or an impact. Whether it was cougar or something else, he couldn't say. He just knew the juvenile needed, the bleeding stopped, and that was the extent of what he could do. Loretta appeared in the doorway behind him. She looked at what was on the porch for a long moment, and then she said, "Is it alive?" He said yes. She disappeared into the house and came back with a towel. She handed it to him. He pressed it against the wound. The juvenile didn't react. Whatever state it was in, it was deep enough that it didn't respond to touch. He turned the flashlight off. He sat on the back porch with his hand on the towel against the wound of something he had no name for, in the dark, in Trinity County, California, in the middle of the night. Loretta sat beside him. They didn't talk. He became aware first of the silence. The whimpering from Patch had stopped. For a few seconds, the property was so quiet that he could hear his own pulse. Then he heard something else. Footsteps, not coming from the ravine, coming along the side of the house, along the same path he'd walked, from the front of the property toward the back. Heavy, deliberate, spaced in a way that told him they were bipedal long before he saw anything. 2 feet. The gait of something that walked upright. He didn't move. His hand stayed on the towel. He became aware gradually of a presence at the edge of the back porch. He didn't see it first. He felt it. And then his eyes adjusted to what they were actually being shown, and he saw it. Standing at the far edge of the porch, at the corner where the railing met the wall, was something large. Very large. It was upright, which put its head at roughly 8 feet, and it was still, the kind of stillness that is not the same as the absence of movement, but is itself a deliberate thing, a quality of held attention. He could see the bulk of it in the moonlight, broad shoulders, thick neck, a head that was large and slightly peaked at the crown, and 2 points of reflected light that were its eyes, catching the ambient moonlight and throwing it back a dim amber. It was looking at the juvenile. He did not raise the rifle. He told me later that the thought of raising the rifle did not occur to him, and he was still not entirely sure why, except that the animal, the being, was looking at the small injured thing on the porch the way that something looks at something it has feeling for. He couldn't have explained that observation in the moment. He couldn't have stood up and justified it. But it was the dominant impression of that first look, and it overrode everything else. He stayed still. Loretta stayed still beside him. He said they weren't even breathing loud. The large one stood at the corner of the porch for a long time. He couldn't say how long, said it might have been 2 minutes and it might have been 10. Then it stepped fully onto the porch. 1 step, slow, not threatening, just present. The boards flexed and creaked under its weight. It was real in a way that things are real when they impose their mass on the physical world around you, when the floor moves under them and the sound of their weight is in the wood. It crouched, lowered itself to where the juvenile was, moving with what he described as a kind of care that you don't usually see in large animals, a deliberateness, like it was being careful about something. It looked at the wound. It put a hand on the juvenile's side, not where the wound was, but on the shoulder. He could see the hand clearly from where he sat, dark-palmed, large, with fingers longer than a man's and a thumb that sat slightly differently than a human thumb, slightly lower but opposing. Then it looked at him. He held very still. It looked at him for what felt like a long time. He said the eyes, at that distance, in the available light, did not look like animal eyes. He stopped here and took a breath before finishing. They looked like they were doing the same thing his were doing, taking him in, working him out. The large one looked at the towel that my grandfather's hand was still holding against the wound on the juvenile. Then it looked at my grandfather. Then it looked back at the towel. He said, "I think it understood what I was doing." He didn't move his hand. The towel stayed against the wound. After a while, he couldn't say how long, the large one rose. It picked the juvenile up with an ease that gave him a clear sense of the strength involved. The way picking something up easily tells you something about how strong the thing doing the lifting is. The juvenile lay in its arms the way a child lies in an adult's arms, slack, trusting, curled slightly. It turned toward the edge of the porch, and here is the part I keep coming back to. Before it stepped off the porch and into the dark, it turned its head and looked at my grandfather one more time. He said there was no menace in it. There was no threat, no display, no aggression of any kind. He said it looked at him the way one person looks at another person when something has happened between them that neither of them has words for, but both of them know they'll carry. Then it stepped off the porch and into the night, and within a few seconds, it was gone. Not running, he didn't think. Walking but fast, the way something large and powerful can walk fast when it decides to. He heard the footfalls for a moment, heavy and measured, crossing the yard toward the ravine, and then nothing. He and Loretta sat on the back porch for another hour without talking. The smell faded slowly. Patch was still under the front porch. The blood on the boards of the back porch was real and dark and already drying at the edges. He told me they didn't speak during that hour. He said it wasn't that there was nothing to say. It was that any sentence either of them could have formed would have been insufficient for what had just happened, and they both knew it. And so they sat with the knowledge of it, without trying to compress it into language. At one point, Loretta reached over and put her hand over his hand, the one that had held the towel, and she left it there for a while. That was all. The smell dissipated slowly. It didn't blow away. It just thinned over the course of that hour, the way fog thins, until by the time they finally went inside, it was only a trace on the back of the throat. He said he could still smell it on the towel the next morning. He buried the towel in the trash at the bottom of the bin, under everything else, the way you bury things you don't want anyone to ask about. He lay awake for the rest of the night. Not from fear, he said. From the weight of what his brain was trying to do, which was integrate what he'd seen and experienced into a version of the world that could hold it. Loretta slept, eventually. He could hear her breathing in the dark beside him, and he was grateful for it, for the sound of another person in the room. He lay on his back and looked at the ceiling and listened to the property outside settle and creak in the late summer dark, and tried to account for what he knew. He knew the tracks he'd found at the stock pond were real. He knew the tracks in the ravine were real. He knew the knocking sounds were real, that they'd been answered from a second location, that 2 sounds in 2 locations meant 2 sources. He knew that Patch, a dog he'd had for 7 years, and who had never failed to bark at anything that came onto the property, had been put into a state of terror by something she would not face or move toward. He knew a juvenile of something had been on his back porch bleeding, and that an adult of the same something had come for it and had taken it back into the dark. He knew his hand had been on a towel against the wound of that juvenile, and that the adult had seen his hand there and had understood, in some way, what that meant. He knew the eyes. He kept coming back to the eyes. Not the color or the placement or the size, though all of those were wrong enough to notice. The quality of the look. He'd been looked at by plenty of animals over the years, deer and elk and black bear, and once a mountain lion that he'd come around a bend and nearly walked into on a trail south of the property. Animals look at you in a specific way that has to do with assessment and threat evaluation and not much else. What he'd seen in those eyes on the porch was something different, something he struggled to name, and finally named as the closest thing he could call it. Consideration. The thing had been considering him, not sizing him up for threat, considering him, taking him in as a thing worth being considered. That, more than anything else, was what kept him awake until dawn. I'm going to pause here for a moment before I get into what happened next, and what my grandfather did in the weeks that followed, and what it cost him, and what it cost my family. Because I want to sit with that image for a second. A man on a porch in the California mountains in the middle of the night, a towel in his hand, watching something he has no category for walk back into the dark with its young, and choosing, in the moment when he had a rifle in his hands, and every reason to be afraid, to hold very still and keep his hand on the towel. His name was Arlen Pruitt. He was 59 years old. He'd spent his whole life in those mountains, and he'd never been a man who talked about himself or his choices or what they meant. But he made a choice on that porch, and it held for 42 years, and I think it's important that I tell you what it was. The next morning, Loretta scrubbed the blood off the back porch boards without being asked to. She didn't say anything about it. She got a bucket and a brush and she cleaned it, and when she was done, she went back inside and made breakfast. My grandfather watched her from the kitchen table and thought about what that meant, that she'd already decided something, that whatever they'd both decided in the night without discussing it, she'd confirmed in the morning by cleaning up the evidence and not asking any questions about what to do next. There was a lot of blood, not a lethal amount, he thought. He'd seen enough working injuries in timber over the years to have an eye for what bleeds out and what doesn't. But enough. Enough that he spent the morning trying not to think too hard about whether the juvenile had survived the night. The tracks were clear in the morning light. He went down to the back of the yard carefully, not going further than the yard's edge where it dropped into the ravine. The grass was pressed in a wide area near the back of the yard, and in the softer soil near the ravine's edge. The tracks came up from below. A single large set, the adult, and beside it, less distinct, the smaller prints of the juvenile, which meant it had been walking at least part of the way. He took some comfort in that. He counted the sets of prints. One adult coming up, tracks deep and widely spaced, suggesting it had been moving with purpose and probably some speed. One adult going back down, different depth ratio now. The heels were deeper than before, the ball of the foot less so, which is what happens when something is carrying weight. He went back to the house. He told Loretta what he'd found in the tracks, that the juvenile had been moving under its own power on the way back. She nodded. Neither of them said anything else about it that morning. He spent the rest of that morning on ordinary tasks, which he found necessary in a way that surprised him. He repaired a section of chicken wire on the coop that had been coming loose from its staples. He checked the oil in the tractor. He walked the north fence line, which didn't need walking, just to have something to do with his feet, while his brain processed what it needed to process. He told me he had a habit, when something big had happened, of letting his hands work while his mind worked, the two things going parallel. And he'd learned over the years to trust that eventually the mind would produce something useful if the hands were kept busy. What the mind produced that morning, over the chicken wire and the tractor oil and the north fence line, was the outline of a decision. He was going to keep this to himself. He wasn't going to rationalize it away, the way he'd tried to rationalize the tracks at the stock pond. He wasn't going to add to it or embellish it or build it into something more than what it was. He was going to keep it exactly as it was, a thing that had happened on his property in the night, that he'd responded to in the way that had seemed right in the moment, and that had resolved in a way that left both parties intact. He was going to carry it quietly, the way you carry a private knowledge of something that only belongs partly to you. Dale came by that afternoon. Dale was my grandfather's eldest, 19 that summer, working at a mill in Weaverville and living there during the week, but he came home most weekends. He noticed the scrubbed boards on the back porch immediately, because they were a different shade than the rest of the weathered wood, and he asked what had happened. My grandfather told him they'd had a dog come up on the porch overnight, probably injured, probably run off a deer kill by something bigger. Dale asked what kind of dog, and my grandfather described something vague that was technically not a lie, and was also completely misleading. Dale accepted it. He was 19, and not particularly suspicious of his father. My grandfather told me, sitting on the front porch in 2019, that keeping it from Dale was the hardest part of the following weeks. Not because he was worried Dale wouldn't believe him. He had the tracks. He had the blood evidence before it was cleaned. He had his own clear recall of a night that was not ambiguous in any way. He was worried about what Dale would do with it. Dale was 19 and restless and had a rifle and a truck and a circle of friends who were similar. If Dale knew that there was something large and unknown living in the ravine below the house, my grandfather did not trust that Dale's response would match the response that had been on the porch that night. He didn't say that in exactly those words. He said, "I didn't want it hunted." and then he looked out at the tree line and added, almost to himself, "It trusted me. I wasn't going to pay that back with a search party." There's a way that sentence sounds sentimental that I don't think it was. My grandfather was not a sentimental man. He was a practical man who had been extended something, not kindness exactly, but some form of trust, or at least a form of not running, not attacking, not treating him as a threat, and who had responded to it in kind, in the only way he knew how, which was by holding still and keeping his hand on the towel. And now, he had an obligation that existed whether he wanted it or not. He didn't go looking for the tracks again. He gave it the ravine. He made sure the dogs stayed closer to the house after dark, which he managed by keeping Patch inside at night, which Loretta was fine with. He didn't put up any more no trespassing signs on the south fence. He didn't talk about it with Roy Sandoval or Gus Fenwick or anyone in Hayfork. He closed the chapter in the way that people in that county closed chapters, by not reopening it. But the chapter didn't close on its own. The weeks after September 4th were strange in a way he found difficult to account for. And when he talked about them in 2019, he was careful to separate what he knew had happened from what he'd felt happening, because he was a man who kept those two categories distinct. What he knew. The knocking sounds continued 2 or 3 times a week through the rest of September and into October, always at night, always in pairs. The deer behavior normalized slightly, the way it does in early fall when the rut begins and the bucks have other things on their minds. Patch continued to sleep inside. He found no further tracks at the stock pond or along the south fence line, though the ground was drying out by that point in the season, and tracking conditions were poor. What he felt, something in the quality of his attention to the property, had shifted. He found himself checking the south tree line from the kitchen window in the mornings, not anxiously, but the way you check on a thing you've taken responsibility for. He noticed the chickens' behavior more carefully. He noticed when Patch's ears went up and when they didn't. He found himself on the back porch more often in the evenings than he'd been before, sitting with a cup of coffee and watching the dark past the yard's edge, not waiting for anything in particular, but present to whatever might happen. Loretta noticed this shift in him. She didn't comment on it directly. But one evening in late September, when he'd been sitting on the back porch for close to an hour, and came inside to find her still at the kitchen table over a cup of tea she'd let go. Cold, she said, "You're keeping watch." He said he supposed he was. She said, "Good." And she poured out the cold tea and went to bed. He told me that was one of the things he loved most about Loretta in 48 years of marriage. She never asked him to explain himself. She assessed the situation, determined whether his response to it was reasonable, and if it was, she supported it without requiring justification. He said there weren't many people in his life he could say that about. But he put the bolt on the back porch door. He told me he put it on in October of 1977, about 6 weeks after that night. He said it wasn't fear that drove it, not exactly. It was more that the bolt was an acknowledgement. It was him saying, in the only language that made sense for the situation, that he understood the terms. The back porch was a threshold. What happened on thresholds was not for everyone. The bolt was not to keep something out. It was to keep his household in, to ensure that nobody went through that door in the night without choosing to, without understanding what they might be choosing. He said, "I never told your grandmother why I put it up. She already knew." I want to stop here for a second and tell you what that bolt meant to me growing up. because I think it adds something to the rest of the story, and I should have included it earlier. I spent most of my summers at my grandparents' property, from the time I was about 7 until I was 15 or so. My dad grew up in that house, and he had a pull toward it that meant we ended up there for a few weeks every summer without fail. To me as a kid, the place was the most complete version of freedom I could access. Woods, creek, the stock pond, where you could catch small bass if you were patient, a barn with a rope swing, and a loft full of old tools and smells that I've never encountered anywhere else since. It was the standard childhood paradise in retrospect that I think a lot of people have when they've had a good rural experience as a kid. The bolt was just part of the house's personality. You learned it the way you learned anything about an adult's house. Don't leave the gate open. Stack the wood bark side down. The back porch door stays bolted after dark. I didn't ask why, because it never occurred to me to ask why. Grandpa had rules, and the rules were the rules, and there was no emotional charge around them that would make a kid curious. He wasn't angry about the rule or nervous about it. It was just a rule. But I remember 2 specific incidents from those summers that I've thought about a lot since July of 2019. The first was when I was 9, maybe 10. I'd been outside, later than I was supposed to be, chasing fireflies at the edge of the yard in the summer dark, and I came around the side of the house to the back porch, and the door was there, and I reached for the handle to go in, and my grandfather appeared from somewhere. I genuinely couldn't tell you where, and put his hand over my hand on the handle and said quietly, "Front door." Not angry, not sharp, just clear. I went around to the front. Nothing else was said. The second was when I was 13. I was up late one August night, after everyone else had gone to bed, sitting at the kitchen table reading, and I heard something outside, a sound from behind the house, from the direction of the ravine. I couldn't identify it. It wasn't an animal I knew. It was rhythmic and low, and had a quality I can only describe as deliberate, the way a sound is different when something is making it on purpose. I got up and went to the back door, and my hand was on the bolt, and I almost opened it. I don't know why I didn't. I was 13, alone in the kitchen, and there was a sound outside that I wanted to explain. The smart thing, the curious thing, would have been to crack the door and look. But something stopped me. Some piece of absorbed understanding that I couldn't have articulated then, and can only half articulate now. I went back to the table. I sat back down. I listened until the sound stopped, which it did after a few minutes. Then I went to bed. I never told my grandfather about that night. After he told me the story in 2019, I asked him about it, whether the sounds I'd heard as a kid on that property were what I was now thinking they were. He looked at me for a long moment. He said he thought they probably were. He said he was glad I'd left the bolt shut. The knocking sounds continued for the rest of that September and into October, less frequently as the fall deepened. He heard them maybe 6 more times over those 2 months, always in pairs, always from the ravine or the ridgeline above it, always at night. Then they stopped. He didn't know if that was seasonal movement or a response to the early winter conditions. Trinity County gets snow by November, most years in the upper elevations, and the animals shift accordingly. Or whether there was some other reason. He didn't know, and he made a point of not trying too hard to know. The following spring, in April of 1978, he found tracks in the stock pond mud again. 2 sets, adult-sized. He didn't measure them this time. He looked at them for a moment, and then he went back up to the house. He told Loretta at dinner. She asked if he thought it was the same ones. He said he thought it might be. She said that was good and passed him the bread. He heard the knocking sounds twice that spring, once in late April and once in early May, then nothing until the fall, then nothing at all after November. The following year, 1979, he found a single set of tracks in early spring, one adult. He didn't find the smaller ones. He didn't know what that meant, and he tried to make himself not think about it too hard. By 1980, the sign in the ravine had become something he checked for the way a farmer checks a fence line, part of the regular assessment of the property. Some years there was more evidence, some years less. Some years he heard the knocking, and some years he didn't. The deer continued to behave oddly in late summer, which he'd come to accept as a kind of seasonal indicator, like robins in the spring. The dogs learned to stay out from under the back porch on certain nights, which he took as another. He found gifts twice in those early years. He hesitated over that word when he told me, said he didn't know if gift was the right one, but he didn't have a better one. The first time was in the spring of 1979. He went down the trail to the ravine after a week of rain and found a dead rabbit at the base of the trail, laid on a flat rock. Placed, not dropped, parallel to the rock's long edge, front paws together, as deliberate as anything he'd ever seen, no sign of feeding on it. The rabbit had been killed recently. He stood there looking at it for a while, and then he went back up to the house and told Loretta, who said it was probably a coincidence, which both of them knew wasn't what she actually thought. The second time was in the fall of 1981. He found a piece of antler at the stock pond, right at the mud's edge, propped upright against a reed stem, a fork of mule deer antler, the kind that drops naturally in late winter, found and moved somewhere else. He kept it. It sat on his desk for the rest of his life. Those two objects, the rabbit on the flat rock and the fork of antler at the stock pond, are the things I find myself circling back to most often when I try to understand what my grandfather understood. Because there's a version of both of those events that is just nature. Rabbits die. Antler drops in the woods and gets moved around by things. You can build a case that neither of those things was placed with intent, that a man who'd had an unusual experience was pattern matching, finding significance in coincidence. But my grandfather was a man who had spent his entire life in the woods, who knew what a dead rabbit that had been killed and left looked like versus a dead rabbit that had been placed. He'd been a timber faller for 2 decades, which means he understood the difference between a thing that fell where gravity put it and a thing that was set. The rabbit's front paws were together. It was parallel to the long edge of the rock, centered the way you'd center something if you were placing it deliberately. He stood there for a long time and looked at it and made his assessment the way he'd been making assessments about physical evidence his whole working life. And his assessment was that it had been placed. The antler was the same, propped upright against a reed stem at the mud's edge of the stock pond. Antler doesn't end up vertical by accident. It falls. It lies flat. If it tumbles into water, it floats or it sinks. It doesn't stand up. He looked at it for a while, and then he picked it up and turned it over in his hands, and felt the weight of it and thought about what it meant that something had found this piece of shed antler, carried it to the stock pond, and stood it up at the water's edge. He didn't have a clean interpretation. He said that much very directly when he told me. He didn't want to attach a meaning to it that was more than the evidence supported. What the evidence supported was deliberate placement. What the deliberate placement meant, whether it was communication, whether it was something closer to the ritual behavior that primates demonstrate in the wild. Whether it was something else entirely, he couldn't say. He just kept the antler and said thank you to the stock pond mud and the tree line beyond it, and went back up to the house. He never went looking. That was the rule he'd made himself, the complement to the bolt on the door. He would observe, he would acknowledge, he would not pursue. He would not try to establish anything deliberate, would not leave food, would not attempt to set up any systematic contact that required the other party to respond. Whatever was going on in that ravine was going on its own terms, and his role was to keep the property a place where those terms were respected. He thought of it, when he thought of it at all, as the maintenance of a condition, not a relationship, a condition. He had 2 more direct encounters in the 30 years he lived on that property after 1977. The first was in the summer of 1983. He was coming back from the stock pond at dusk, the light going orange and flat across the cleared land, and he walked around the corner of the outbuilding and nearly walked into something standing at the corner of the barn. He pulled up short. They were maybe 8 feet apart. He took in what he was looking at in the way you take in something your brain isn't prepared for, in pieces, starting with the wrong details. The height, the width, the hands, the smell, which was there but not as overwhelming as it had been in 77, either because he'd grown more familiar with it or because the wind was different. The eyes, which were at his level and above, catching the last light. He said they looked at each other for maybe 30 seconds. He didn't move. It didn't move. Then it stepped back, 2 steps, and turned, and walked along the south side of the barn toward the back of the property, gone into the trees. He stood there for a while after, long enough that Loretta came to the back door to see if he was all right. He told her yes. She looked at him the way she did when she knew something had happened that he wasn't going to tell her right now, and went back inside. The second time was 1991. He was working on the south fence line, the cedar post replacement that's been an ongoing project on that property since before I can remember, and he was working a corner post with a post hole digger when he had the feeling of being watched. He'd learned to trust that feeling over the years. He stopped digging and looked up toward the tree line on the south side, the Forest Service land, and there was one standing at the edge of the trees, maybe 100 yards out in the shade, partly screened by a stand of young fir. It was watching him work. He could see it clearly enough to note that it was large, that it stood upright, and that it did not seem alarmed by him, which he took as a kind of commentary on how many years this had been going on. Then it stepped back into the trees and was gone. He finished the post hole. He went back up to the house. He washed his hands at the outdoor tap, the way he always did after fencing work, and he stood there with the water running over his hands and looked out at the tree line for a few minutes before he went inside. The tree line was empty. Nothing moved, but the feeling of being observed, which had been a constant companion for 30 seconds while he was digging, was gone as cleanly as it had come, as if a switch had been thrown. What I find most striking about the 1991 encounter, when my grandfather described it, was the change in the quality of the watching. In 1977, when the sign first started appearing, there had been a wariness to it. The deer pressured down, patch frozen in the yard, the knocking sounds always from a distance, and at night. In 1983, the one at the barn had been close, had held its ground for 30 seconds, and there had been a quality to the encounter that my grandfather described as direct, the way a direct look across a room is different from a glance. But in 1991, what he described was something different again. He said the one watching him work from the tree line wasn't hiding. It was in shade, partially screened by the young fir, but it wasn't concealed. It was simply standing where it preferred to stand while it did what it was doing, which was watching a man dig a fence post hole. He worked the digger. He'd pull a scoop of dirt, set it aside, lower the digger again. He could feel the watching the whole time, the way you feel a pair of eyes on you even when you're not looking at the source. He told me that after a few minutes of this, he stopped worrying about it and just kept working. And after a while, he said, the awareness of being watched started to feel less like surveillance and more like company. He thought about that word afterward, company. It was the wrong word in some ways, too warm maybe, too familiar. But it was the closest he could get. Something large was standing in the shade of the trees, watching him work a fence post, and after his initial tension resolved, the quality of the afternoon was not unpleasant. He said the one in 1991 looked older to him than the one in 1983, but he acknowledged he had no real basis for comparison. That distinguishing age in something he'd only seen twice was probably beyond his ability. It was an impression, something in the way it held itself, the particular patience of it, that read to him as belonging to an animal well past the middle of its life. He thought about the juvenile from 1977 and calculated the math and decided he wasn't going to do that calculation because the answer it suggested was the kind of thing you could get too attached to. He finished the post hole. He went back up to the house. He told me all of this over the course of about 4 hours, sitting on the front porch with the iced tea going warm and the light moving around through the afternoon. And at the end of it, he was quiet for a while. He looked the way he always looked when he'd run out of words for something, which was not often, like there was more to it that didn't have language yet. We sat for a while in that quiet. The afternoon had gone to gold, and the shadows were long across the yard. I could hear a woodpecker working something in the Douglas firs across the road, the particular rapid-fire percussion that carries a long way in mountain air. My grandfather was watching the trees on the far side of the road, the way he'd watched tree lines his whole life. Automatic, comprehensive. Reading for information the way some people read text, he said, after a while, "I'm going to tell you why I'm telling you now." I said, "Okay." He said that for 40 years he'd kept the story because it was a private thing, not his to share. He'd made his peace with not knowing everything, with being one party to an arrangement whose terms he understood only from one side. He'd been fine with that. But in the last couple of years, as the dementia started coming in patches, he'd started thinking about what happened to knowledge when the person who held it was gone. He said there were things about the property that he wanted my dad to know. The south drainage, the way the deer behaved in late August, what those signs meant and what to do when they appeared. The bolt. What the bolt was for. Not just that it was there. He said he'd tried to tell my dad once a few years back, and had gotten about 3 sentences in before he saw my dad's face, and understood that my dad needed the story to not be real. That the world where his father was a sensible man who'd lived a rational life in the mountains was a world my dad needed to preserve, and that the story was a threat to that preservation. He stopped telling it. He said, "You're different, you'll carry it right." I didn't ask what carrying it right meant. I thought I understood. I asked him why he never told anyone. Not just about the night on the porch, but about any of it. Years of sign, 2 more encounters, decades of knowing something was living in that ravine below his house. He was not a man who went to churches or civic meetings, or who cared about what people thought of him, which meant the social calculation wasn't really it. He said, because it wasn't mine to tell. He looked at the tree line for a while after he said that. The light had moved around to the low-angle gold of late afternoon, the kind that makes Trinity County look like a painting that has nothing to do with anything hard or complicated. He had his iced tea in both hands, and he was looking at the trees, and I had the sense that he was back there in some way, on the property, in the years after 77, doing the slow work of maintaining a condition he couldn't explain to anyone. I asked him if he'd ever been afraid during those 30 years. Not the night on the porch, which I could understand the fear of, but the long stretch after, the decades of coexistence. He thought about it in the careful way he thought about things he wanted to answer precisely. He said there were moments, not the knocking sounds. He'd stopped being alarmed by those fairly quickly after 77 once he understood what they were and what they weren't. The 2 direct encounters were different. The one at the barn in 83 had produced something he might call fear, at least at the front end of it, in those first few seconds, before his brain caught up with the situation. The 91 one less so. He said the diminishing fear across those 20 years was not a function of becoming complacent. It was a function of accumulated evidence. The evidence said that nothing was trying to hurt him. The evidence was consistent across a long time. He'd learned to trust the evidence. But he said the night on the porch, the original night, he'd been afraid in a way that was different from any fear he'd experienced before or after. Not physical fear, not the clear animal fear of immediate threat, but something he described as the fear that comes when the size of the world suddenly becomes apparent. When you realize that the map you've been using doesn't cover the territory. He said there was a moment, sitting on that porch with his hand on the towel, and the adult standing at the edge looking at the juvenile, when he understood with absolute clarity that the world was larger and stranger than he had believed, and that this new size was permanent. He would never go back to the version of the world that didn't contain this, and that realization, the permanence of it, was frightening in a way that had nothing to do with whether he was physically in danger. He said, "It came up on that porch because it was out of options. Something had happened to the young one and it needed help, and it made a decision that I cannot imagine making. It came up on that porch in the dark, with a bleeding child, in a place it had been avoiding. And I had a rifle, and I didn't use it, and I helped, and it left. That was between me and it. Bringing other people into that changes what it was." I thought about that for a long time. I thought about the bolt on the back door that I'd grown up not being able to open after dark. I thought about my grandmother cleaning the porch boards in the morning without saying a word, the way she'd put the .22 behind the closet door without being asked, the way the whole thing had been sealed up in that family for 42 years, not out of shame or fear, but out of some form of respect that didn't have a name in the language we had for things. I asked him what he thought the wound had been from. He said he'd thought about it a lot over the years. His best guess was a cougar. Trinity County had a stable mountain lion population, and the lions and the deer weren't the only thing competing for territory in those drainages. Whether a lion had gotten to a young one, or whether it had been something else, a territorial dispute of some kind, something within their own social dynamic that he had no insight into. He couldn't say. He just knew that whatever had happened, the adult had made a decision to come to the only place it knew was occupied by a creature that might help. It had been watching for years, he said, since before 77, maybe long before. It knew what we were. It decided to try us. He paused for a long time. Then he said, "I hope it lived, the young one. I've hoped that my whole life." My grandfather also told me, near the end of that afternoon, about something he'd never spoken of even to Loretta. In 1977, a few weeks after the night on the porch, he'd driven into Hayfork on a Saturday and gone to the county library. Trinity County in 1977 had a small branch library on the main street, open 3 days a week, staffed by a woman named Peggy Alcott, who'd been the librarian there since 1961. He asked her if they had anything on large undescribed primates in North America. She looked at him for a moment, and then said they had a few things, mostly newspaper clippings and some pamphlets, and she'd file index them under Native American oral tradition, which she acknowledged was not a perfect fit, but was the closest category she had. He sat at a table in the back of that library for 2 hours reading what she brought him, newspaper accounts from the 1920s and 1930s, mostly from the Pacific Northwest, reports from loggers and prospectors, accounts that had been printed with varying degrees of skepticism by papers in Humboldt and Del Norte and Trinity counties over the previous 50 years. He read about the Patterson film from 1967, shot about 130 miles north of where he was sitting in the Bluff Creek drainage, which he'd heard about at the time, but hadn't thought about much. He read some Hoopa Valley and Yurok material that Peggy had on hand, accounts of what the tribes in the region called the Oma, which appears in their oral tradition as a large, intelligent being that occupies the mountain country and operates by its own rules that are knowable but not widely known. He spent a while on the Patterson film material specifically. The film had been shot in October of 1967 in the Bluff Creek drainage in Del Norte County, about 130 miles north of where he was sitting. Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin had been riding horses on a sandbar along Bluff Creek when they encountered what Patterson filmed, a large bipedal figure crossing the bar, now known from the footage as Patty. The film had been widely circulated and widely debated in the years since. Every few years a new article came out claiming it was a hoax, and every few years a different article came out with a new analysis suggesting it wasn't. What my grandfather found most useful about the Patterson film wasn't the debate around it. It was the specifics of what the film showed. He'd been looking for confirmation, some external record that matched what he'd seen on the porch in September, and what he found in the film was something that matched in the ways that mattered: the proportions, the stride, the way the figure moved on 2 legs, without any of the compensating sway that a human uses when walking, a different biomechanical structure entirely, one that implied a different arrangement of bone and muscle that he didn't have vocabulary for, but could recognize in comparison to the juvenile he'd seen on his porch. The film was grainy and short and had been analyzed to death. But for a man who'd spent the last few weeks asking himself whether what he'd seen was real, it functioned as a kind of anchor. It wasn't the same thing he'd seen, but it was the same kind of thing. The Hoopa Valley and Yurok material gave him something different, something harder to categorize. The Hoopa people, whose traditional territory encompasses much of the Trinity River drainage, including the watershed that runs past the property my grandfather built his house on, have a long tradition of accounts of a being they call the Oma, sometimes rendered as Oma. Peggy Alcott's files on this were thin, a few photocopied pages from an anthropological paper, and some notes from a presentation at the Hayfork Library some years earlier by a professor from Humboldt State. But what was? There was specific enough to be striking. The Oma Inhupa tradition is not primarily a fearsome thing. It is a being that lives in the high country and the deep drainages, that has its own social structure, that is capable of both aggression and non-aggression, depending on whether its boundaries are respected. The accounts describe something that is territorial, in the way that any large animal is territorial, but that also shows a degree of social complexity beyond pure territorial behavior. There are accounts of Oma interacting with people in ways that are not threatening, of exchanges, of a mutual recognition that both parties are there and that neither is prey. There are accounts of people who have gone into the deep drainages, into the country where the Oma ranges, and come back with the sense that they had been observed and permitted to pass. My grandfather sat with those pages for a long time. He thought about the porch. He thought about a being that had watched his property for years, learning who was there and what they did and what they were, and then had made a choice, bringing the juvenile to the only light it knew, to the only other creature in range that had demonstrated, through years of not hunting and not pursuing, that it might be trusted with something injured and young. The Oma in the Hupa accounts is not a monster. It is something that lives alongside people, at a careful distance, by its own choice. He read all of this carefully. He took no notes. He didn't check anything out. He drove home, and he didn't tell Loretta where he'd been, just said he'd had some errands. He told me that he read everything available to him that afternoon, and came away understanding two things. One, that what he'd encountered was not unique, had been encountered by others across a wide geography for a long time, and was therefore not a product of his own imagination or some specific anomaly of that particular drainage. The accounts from the Hupa Valley and Yurok material in particular gave him a framework he found more useful than the newspaper reports, because those accounts didn't treat the thing as a mystery to be solved or a trophy to be taken. They treated it as a neighbor, in the deep sense, something that occupied the same country and operated by rules that could be learned if you were patient and respectful enough to learn them. He found that more compatible with his experience than anything the newspapers had to offer. 2, that none of what he'd read told him anything useful about how to behave specifically in the situation he was in. Every account was either a fright and run story or a hunt and miss story. Nobody had written about sitting on a porch in the dark with their hand on a towel. He was, as far as the available literature could tell him, in uncharted territory. He decided that was all right. He would work it out on first principles. He had spent his entire working life making judgments in the field without a manual for the specific situation in front of him. You can't timber fall old-growth fir by a checklist. You have to read the lean and the wind and the fiber and the ground and make a call. This was the same skill set in a different context, which was, in the end, very much who he was. He died in February of 2021, 18 months after he told me the story. He was 83. He'd had 2 more years of the vascular dementia advancing until he wasn't really there most of the time. And then he wasn't there at all. He left the property to my dad, who has kept it. The house is still on the South Fork of the Trinity, about 12 miles southeast of Hayfork. The barn is still there. The stock pond is still there, though it's been dry for longer stretches in recent years than my grandfather ever saw. The back door still has the bolt. I went out there last spring, the first spring after the property transferred to my dad, and I walked the south fence line the way my grandfather used to. I checked the stock pond mud for tracks. I walked down the trail into the ravine, which had water in it that spring because it had been a wet winter. The creek was maybe 3 inches deep over smooth basalt, cold and clear, and the cottonwoods along the bank had leafed out a pale new green. I stood in the ravine in the morning light with the creek running over the rocks around my boots, and I tried to imagine it in 1977, dry, late summer, the tracks in the silt at the base of the boulder, 3 sets, 2 adults, and a juvenile that wandered a little, investigated things, went in a circle. I tried to imagine what it felt like to be young and to move down that creek bed in the dark, and then to have something happen to you, and then to be carried up toward a light, to lay on planks that smelled of cut wood and axle grease and old paint, to have the pressure on the wound from a hand that was the wrong shape and the right intention, to be carried back down into the dark. I didn't find any tracks that day, but I've been back 3 times since, and on the second visit, in a stretch of soft soil near the spring that feeds the stock pond, I found something. I'm going to be careful about how I describe it, because I'm not an expert in tracks, and I'm aware of how much the mind can shape what it wants to see. What I found were 2 impressions in the soil, roughly ovoid, large, spaced about 4 feet apart. The edges were not crisp. They'd been there a while, enough that some crumbling had occurred. I couldn't count toes. I couldn't make out a clear heel or ball distinction. I could have been looking at 2 random depressions in soft ground made by anything. But they were large, and they were spaced in a way that made my hands go still in my jacket pockets while I stood there looking at them. I didn't measure them. I left them there. I walked back up to the house and I told my dad what I'd found and where, and he nodded the way my grandfather used to nod when he'd already thought about a thing longer than you had. He said he'd noticed the deer coming into the yard in the afternoon again this summer, earlier than they usually did, with their heads up and their ears working. The back door bolt is still there. I checked it before I left. Heavy iron, the kind my grandfather installed the year he built the house, 1962, 15 years before the night on the porch. Which means he'd put it on before the night in 77, which means he'd known something was in that ravine, or suspected something was, long before the juvenile showed up bleeding on his back porch. He'd bolted the door before anything happened, and he'd kept it bolted after, and the only explanation that makes any sense is that at some point before 1962, before the house was even built, something happened that gave him the rule. I didn't know to ask him about that. I didn't think of it until after he was gone, and I was sitting at his kitchen table after the service, going through the things he'd kept in the house, and I found in the drawer of his desk a folded piece of notebook paper that had been folded so many times the creases were white and the paper was soft at the folds. I opened it. It was a sketch. My grandfather was not an artist, but he was precise. He'd spent his life in timber, which is a trade that lives on measurement and proportion, and the sketch had that quality. It showed a hand, human-shaped but not quite human. Palm wider than a man's, fingers longer, the thumb set lower and slightly off-angle. He'd sketched it from memory. There was no hand it was copied from. He'd drawn it the way you draw something you need to fix in your mind before the memory of it starts to shift. Under the sketch, in his handwriting, he'd written a date. August 1954. He would have been 36 in August of 1954. 23 years before the night on the porch. 23 years before the bolt. 8 years before the house was even built. Whatever he'd seen in 1954, wherever he'd been, whatever had shown him that hand up, close enough to draw it from memory, that was where this had started. That was the first page of a story I'll never get to hear in full. I've spent a fair amount of time since finding that sketch, trying to work out what August of 1954 might have looked like for a 36-year-old man in Trinity County. He would have been working general labor by then, post-Darnell, pre-property. He might have been on a fencing crew somewhere in the county. He might have been doing road work. He might have been hunting, which was something he did every fall in that country, going back to boyhood. He might have been on the South Fork drainage. The land where he'd eventually build the house had been in the family, technically, since his father had bought it in the 30s, but it was just a piece of unimproved mountain land, and nobody used it for anything in particular. Arlen might have been up there for any number of reasons, scouting deer before the season, checking the seasonal creek, just walking it, the way people walk a piece of land they own and haven't done anything with yet. What I think happened, based on everything he told me and the 42 years of what followed, is that he encountered something in August of 1954 that he wasn't prepared for, and that he recorded in the only way available to him, on a piece of notebook paper with a folding rule as reference. He drew the hand. He wrote the date. He put the paper in his desk, and he kept it there for 65 years. And then, in 1960, he built his house on that land. He put a bolt on the back door. He was 36 when he drew the sketch, and 44 when he bolted the door. And whatever happened in between those two dates that made him choose that land and that door configuration, I will never know. He chose to put his house there. He chose the bolt. Maybe those choices were connected to what he'd seen in 1954. Maybe they weren't. Maybe a piece of him had decided, at 36, that a piece of land with something like that on it was worth more, not less, to him. That he wanted to be adjacent to it. That he wanted to build something on the boundary between the world he knew and the world he'd been shown. He died with that piece of paper in his desk drawer. He'd never destroyed it. He'd never shown it to anyone, as far as I know. I have it now, folded the same way he folded it, in a small wooden box on my desk. I don't unfold it very often. When I do, I look at the proportions he drew, palm, fingers, the particular angle of the thumb, and I think about the decades of nights that paper represents, the decades of the bolt on the back door, the decisions made and not made and held to for a whole life. My grandfather was not a storyteller. He was not a man who believed in telling people things they couldn't use. But he told me this story in the last clear afternoon of the last clear year of his life, sitting on the front porch with the iced tea going warm, looking out at the tree line across the road the way he'd been looking at tree lines his whole life. And the reason I think he told me, the reason he chose that afternoon and that story and no other, is because he'd been carrying the weight of it alone for 42 years and he was tired, and also because he trusted me to understand what it meant, which was not that the world is full of monsters. It meant that something was out there, in those mountains, in those drainages, in the second-growth fir and tanawac along the South Fork, that had decided at some point to try one of us, to take a risk that must have been enormous from its perspective, to carry an injured young one up in the dark to the only source of light and lay it on a porch and wait. And that a man named Arlen Pruitt had been standing there when it happened, with a rifle in his hands, and had understood, in some place older than his training or his habits, what was being asked of him. He held still. He kept his hand on the towel. And for 30 years after that, the ravine below his house continued to offer its signs in the proper seasons, and the deer came in earlier than they should have in late August, and the dogs learned which nights to stay close, and the bolt on the back door stayed shut from dusk to dawn, and whatever understanding existed between my grandfather and whatever lived in that ravine held quietly, without a word spoken for the rest of his life. I don't go into the ravine after dark when I'm on the property. I don't know if that's caution or respect or something in between. Maybe it's just that it's my grandfather's rule, and some rules you keep out of love for the person who made them. My dad, when I've talked to him about all of this, is quieter on the subject than I expected him to be. He grew up in that house. He knows the bolt, and he knows the rule, and he knows that his father was not a man who put rules in place without reason. He said to me once, the spring after my grandfather died, that he'd spent most of his life not asking about the bolt, because some part of him had always understood that the answer would be something he couldn't put back once he had it. He said he was a little relieved that my grandfather had told me instead of him. He said he thought he wouldn't have known what to do with it. My dad is a reasonable man. He works in an office. He commutes. He's lived in cities since he left Trinity County at 18, and he's made his life in a world that operates by certain rules about what exists and what doesn't, and those rules have served him fine. The story, if I'd told it to him in any other context, would have been a problem for him. But he knows who his father was, and the fact that his father kept a bolt on the back door, and a sketch in his desk drawer, and an antler piece on his desk for 40-plus years, and never once in all that time gave any of those things up, tells my dad something about what's real. He goes out to the property maybe twice a year. He keeps it maintained. He checks the south fence line and the stock pond and the bolt on the back door. He hasn't said to me what he makes of the deer behavior I mentioned to him, the ones coming in earlier than they should in the afternoon with their heads up. He nodded when I told him. He didn't say anything. I think there's a version of all of this where you focus on what's unknown, where you say we don't have photographs, we don't have a body, we don't have hard scientific evidence, where you say one man's experience in the California mountains in the 1970s is not sufficient basis for concluding that anything unusual lives in those drainages, where you apply all the appropriate skepticism that good thinking requires, and you come out the other side with a shrug and a who knows. I can do that. I can hold the story at that distance if I want to. But I keep coming back to specifics. The folding rule, 14 inches long, 5.5 wide at the ball, 4.5 feet between prints at what looked like a walking gait. The sucking chest sound that he'd been taught to listen for, and that wasn't there. The towel Loretta handed him without being asked. The boards that were a different shade after she cleaned them. The weight in the wood under its feet when it stepped onto the porch. The heel deeper than the ball on the way back down, carrying something. The antler propped upright at the mud's edge. These are the details that a man who made things up would not have included. A man making something up gives you the dramatic moment. The dramatic moment here is not in the details. The dramatic moment is simple, and it's in the middle of the story. Everything around it, before and after, is the texture of a life lived carefully, next to something he couldn't explain. There's one more thing I want to tell you. something I've been turning over since my grandfather told me the story, and that I haven't found a satisfying way to resolve. In 2020, about 8 months before he died, I looked into whether there had been any documented reports from Trinity County that might be contemporaneous with what he'd experienced, any accounts from that area and that era that had entered the public record in some form. I spent a few weeks going through what's available online, databases of historical newspaper archives, a couple of the established reporting organizations that have been collecting accounts for decades. I found 3 reports from Trinity County between 1974 and 1981. I'm not going to cite the specific source in a way that allows easy cross-referencing, because some of the accounts describe the witnesses by profession, if not by name. And I'm not interested in identifying anyone who didn't want to be identified. What I can tell you is that all 3 described encounters in the drainage systems east and south of Hay Fork, which puts them broadly in the same terrain as my grandfather's property. One was a timber cruiser who described something large crossing a logging road in the early morning. One was a rancher who found tracks at a stock pond, tracks she measured at 13 inches and described as similar to a human foot but larger. One was a retired school teacher from Hay Fork who described hearing what she called calling sounds from the ridge above her house at night on multiple occasions in the late 70s, sounds she said were answered from a different direction. None of these people knew each other, as far as I can tell. None of them knew my grandfather. They were separate people in a wide, sparsely populated county, reporting through separate channels, things that aligned, in rough terms, with what my grandfather had been experiencing for years without telling anyone. The rancher with the stock pond tracks, the one who measured them, included one detail in her account that I've thought about a lot. She said she found the tracks in June of 1978, which is about 9 months after the night on the back porch. She said there were 2 sets of adult tracks and one smaller set. She estimated the smaller set at 9 inches. 9 inches. The same size as the ones he'd found in the ravine in August of 1977. I don't know what to make of that. I don't know how far the rancher's property was from my grandfather's. The accounts don't include precise coordinates, and Trinity County is large enough that 2 stock ponds in it could be 2 miles apart or 20. I can't make a definitive claim. But the details sat with me. That smaller set of tracks, 9 inches, at a stock pond in the same county 9 months later. What I did after finding those 3 accounts was try to build a rough geographical picture of what the reporting from Trinity County looked like across that period. This took a few months of intermittent searching, and I want to be honest about the limitations of what I found. The major databases that collect these accounts are self-reported, which means they depend on people choosing to report. And the population of people in rural Trinity County in the 1970s who would report something like this to a centralized database was small. What's in the record is almost certainly a fraction of what was experienced. That said, across the period from 1970 to 1990, there are 11 reports in the databases I found that are attributed to Trinity County or to areas that could plausibly be Trinity County based on the terrain descriptions, even when the county isn't named directly. 11 across 20 years is not a high number for a territory that large. But the geographic clustering in those 11 reports is notable. 9 of the 11 describe encounters in the drainage systems of the South Fork Trinity or its tributaries. The South Fork drains a significant piece of terrain, running roughly from east to west through the central part of the county, and its watershed encompasses several thousand square miles, of national forest land. My grandfather's property sat above one of those South Fork tributaries. The rancher with the 9-inch tracks sat above another. The timber cruiser who reported something crossing a logging road was working in an adjacent drainage. The retired school teacher in Hay Fork, whose account described the calling sounds and the answering calls, lived at the north edge of the same watershed. I'm not drawing a conclusion from this. I'm pointing out a geography. What the geography says is that a large area of very remote terrain along the South Fork Trinity drainage was, across at least 2 decades, generating a consistent pattern of reports from people who didn't know each other and weren't coordinating their accounts. The terrain is real. The Shasta Trinity National Forest land that backs up against my grandfather's south fence line runs without significant interruption for more than 50 miles in some directions. It is, in every practical sense, wilderness. Road access is minimal. Human presence is sparse. If something large and elusive lives in those drainages, the conditions for its long-term persistence there are as good as anywhere on the continent west of the Rockies. My grandfather knew all of that. He didn't need a database to tell him. He'd grown up in it. Last fall, the night before I drove back to the city after a long weekend helping my dad close up the house for winter, I sat on the back porch for a while after supper. I don't know exactly why. I just didn't want to be inside yet, and the night was clear and cold, the stars out over Trinity County, the way they get out there in October, with the whole structure of them visible in a way it never is near town. I sat with my coffee and I looked out at the back of the property, at the tree line at the yard's edge, at the dark drop-off where the ravine begins. The bolt was open behind me, which is not something my grandfather would have done, and I thought about closing it, but I didn't. Nothing happened. The night was quiet, a real quiet, the Trinity County kind where you can hear the creek if you listen hard enough, where the only light for miles is whatever's coming from the house behind you. The temperature was dropping, and eventually I got cold, and I went inside. But before I went inside, I sat there for another minute, just listening. And I thought I could hear, from somewhere down in the ravine, from the dry creek bed or the slope above it, a sound that was not a branch falling and was not an animal I could name. 2 knocks, distinct, deliberate, spaced about 3 seconds apart. Then silence. Then from a different direction, maybe a quarter-mile east along the ridge, 2 knocks back. I set my coffee down on the porch rail. I thought about my grandfather at 59 years old, sitting on this same porch with a rifle across his knees, listening to that sound for the first time, and not knowing yet what it meant, only knowing that something large and deliberate was in the dark below his house, and that it knew he was there, and that it had decided, so far, to let that fact stand. I thought about him sitting there for the first time, not knowing yet what any of it would become, not knowing about the towel, or the porch, or the juvenile, or the 30 years of bolted doors and seasonal sign and antler pieces left at the stock pond, not knowing about the piece of notebook paper folded in his desk, with the hand drawn on it, and the date, 1954. All of that still ahead of him in the dark. Just a man with a rifle and a dog that wouldn't come out from under the porch, and 2 sounds in the woods that shouldn't have been there, and choosing, even then, in that first moment, before he had any reason to choose anything, to sit still and wait instead of going to find out what was making the noise. I sat there for another few minutes after the knocking stopped. The October cold was settling in, the kind that comes down fast in the mountains once the sun drops. I could see my breath starting. The stars were sharp and dense and showed no interest in me or the ravine or whatever was in it. I thought about my grandfather building this house in 1962, choosing this 42 acres above this particular drainage, installing that bolt before the house was even finished. I thought about him 30 years old, 35 years old, out in that timber in the years before and after 1954, learning what country looks like at its edges, at the places where the mapped world runs out and something else begins. I thought about the folded piece of paper in his desk, the careful lines of the hand drawn from memory, the date in his handwriting, the fact that he never threw it away, the fact that he kept it for 65 years like a deed to something. I thought about what it means to be the kind of person who, at 59 years old, on a back porch in the middle of the night, with a rifle and a bleeding unknown thing at your feet, has the presence of mind to hold still, to not run, to not shoot, to keep one hand on the towel and wait for whatever comes next, and respond to it with what the situation actually requires, rather than what your fear says it requires. That's what my grandfather spent 42 years trying to be, in everything. I know that now, in a way, I couldn't have known from anything else he told me. He was patient in the way that people who have learned to be patient the hard way are patient. Not passive, patient. There's a difference that matters. He kept his hand on the towel. For 42 years, in every way available to him, he kept his hand on the towel. I picked up my coffee. I went inside. I threw the bolt. When I drove away from the property the next morning, back toward the highway and the cell signal, and the world that operates by the rules I normally live by, I thought about something my grandfather had said near the end of that afternoon in 2019. Not any of the main story. A small thing he said, almost in passing, as we were taking the iced tea glasses inside. He said he'd sometimes wondered over the years whether he'd made a mistake by not telling anyone, whether there was a better outcome available, some version of the story where he'd contacted a researcher or reported the night on the porch to someone who could have used the information for something. He said he'd never been able to construct that version in a way that satisfied him. Every version where he told someone led to the same place. More people in the ravine, more attention on the drainage, more pressure on something that had made its choice to live at a careful distance from us, and had maintained that choice without incident for as long as he could observe. He said, the thing about keeping something quiet is that quiet is actually something. It's not the absence of an action. It's a choice you make every day. I've been making that choice since July of 2019, with this one exception, the one I'm making right now. And I've thought about whether this exception is a mistake, whether telling the story, even framed the way I'm framing it, changes something, whether the words themselves are a kind of pressure on the South Fork drainage, on whatever has been moving through that ravine, on its own schedule for longer than I've been alive. I decided it doesn't, or I decided the risk of it was worth the value of the story being somewhere besides just inside me. My grandfather spent 42 years being the only container for this. He was 81 when he let it out, with dementia coming in patches and the time he had left shorter than it used to be. I'm telling it now because I'm not going to wait until I'm 81. I'll be back in the spring, and the spring after that. Whatever is down in that ravine, whatever has been using that creek bed and those drainages for longer than my grandfather's 42 years on that property, longer maybe than the house, longer maybe than the road, it can take its time. I'm not going anywhere. And I've already told my dad, When the time comes and the property passes to me, the bolt stays on the door. That's not negotiable. Some things you inherit without choosing them.